The 21st century has been marked by increased conflict, instability, and insecurity worldwide. Many are asking what role the multi-billion-dollar global arms trade plays in creating or remedying this trend of global insecurity. This film explores how the global arms trade affects the security and development of fragile states, and if there should be global regulation on the sale of arms. We understand there are many definitions of a fragile state, but for the purposes of this film, we are defining a fragile state when a country has ineffective institutions to provide the political goods for its citizens, and when it suffers from political violence in the form of a repressive regime or a civil war. We'll provide the context on key players in the global arms trade and their motivations. Then we'll explore the impact of the arms on fragile states and discuss current approaches to regulation. Finally, we will conclude by looking at how the global arms trade has affected Yemen.
The global arms trade is a $1.7 trillion a year industry. According to recent data released by the Stockholm International Peace Research, there is consensus among scholars that a few countries, primarily in the global north, are driving the arms market.
So if we look at maybe the top 5 largest arms exporters over the last 5 years, it would be USA, Russia, France, Germany, China in the order of ranking. So they account for roughly 74% of all global arms exports over the last 5 years.
Dr. Tian also points out the irony that many of the leading exporters of arms are also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. These same countries are also home to the companies leading in arms production, such as Lockheed Martin in the United States and BAE Systems in the UK. BAE Systems didn't respond to our request for comment.
The important countries are then reflected by the important companies, because most of the world's large arms manufacturers manufacture in concert with their governments. So there will be government-to-government arms deals that are then honored by a particular company from that country.
A quick look at the defense budgets of some of the major players highlights the significant investment in military spending. Dr. Tian identifies the biggest global military spenders.
The largest spenders on military spending. These are USA, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia. There's the top 4, the big 4. And the share of, we measure as GDP. So military spending as a percentage of GDP, how much is that? And these actually vary quite a lot. You have China at around 1.9% of GDP and very stable over the last 20 years. So in a way, we see China as being more, the military spending is more sustainable. USA is a bit higher at around 3% of GDP. Then we have Saudi Arabia, which is spending about 10% of the GDP on the military. So that is very clear that it's in the long term unsustainable levels of spending.
The weapons being transferred between countries varies, often reflecting their security and national defense policy. China, for example, hopes to build a blue water navy to increase its influence in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Saudi Arabia is looking to build a very strong air force to buy F-35s, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other small arms and light weapons. It is important to note the significance of small arms and light weapons like AK-47s, automatic rifles, rocket launchers, artillery, and armored personnel carriers. These often have the largest impact on the security and development of fragile states because these are the types of weapons that are commonly used in a violent conflict situation.
The arms recipient countries buy weapons mainly for their safety and protection. But other countries engage in the sale and transfer of arms for economic and political reasons. Economic motives include income in the form of cash or coin, but more importantly, ensuring access to vital natural resources such as access to oil. Job creation is also a frequent economic justification. For example, President Trump talks about the creation of 450,000 jobs through the 110 billion USD arms deal with Saudi Arabia, while also justifying that if USA does not do this deal, its political opponents such as Russia and China will seize the opportunity. Andrew Feinstein sheds further light on the economic motivation of arms deal of Norway to a Nigerian warlord through the facilitation of the British government.
A few years ago, Norway was getting rid of some gunboats that its military no longer needed. And officials in the Norwegian military and foreign ministry decided to sell those gunboats to a Nigerian warlord. This was at a time when that warlord was saying publicly, including on the internet, that if his preferred presidential candidate didn't win an upcoming election, he was going to restart the civil war in the Niger Delta. The Norwegians realized they couldn't sell these boats directly to the warlord. The gunboats were then handed over to this postbox company in the United Kingdom, which didn't really exist. The UK authorities, showing just how lax they are on these sorts of things, happily allowed the further export of these gunboats to the said warlord. The sale of these gunboats could have reignited the civil war in the Niger Delta. But the cash was the most important thing. So no government stopped the export of those boats.
The political or foreign policy reasons are gaining a political ally in the globe. But more importantly, the arms-providing countries exert pressure on their political opponents through access to the countries close to their opponents.
Who they sell to very much varies depending on country-to-country relationships, alliances. So, for instance, USA mostly sells their weapons now to the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates would be the main recipients. Russia very much sells to India and China. And then China sells, say, to Pakistan and Bangladesh.
For example, China sells arms to Pakistan to secure it as an ally, which also takes India's attention off the Indian-Chinese border and on the Indian-Pakistani border. Likewise, China's provision of arms to North Korea has two reasons. A, to gain financial profit, and B, to keep the North Korea as an intransigent opposition against USA. On the other side, the US provision of arms to Taiwan is a retaliation against China.
Bearing these motivations in mind, we'll transition to explore the impact of the global arms trade on fragile states. One argument is that the transfer of arms takes away from spending on critical social services, hindering further development.
The classic argument of guns versus butter. Whatever you spend on the military, the resources can't be, the scarce resources can't be used to be spent on development. So healthcare, right? Education, infrastructure.
Andrew Feinstein saw firsthand evidence of this in South Africa, when the purchase of weapons was prioritized over the purchase and distribution of life-saving antiretroviral medicine.
The government decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that the country had absolutely no need of and has therefore barely used until today, where there were massive, pressing socioeconomic and developmental needs. And when one realizes that the sort of trade-off that was made in that transaction was that at the time that we were spending this $10 billion on weapons, our then president, Thabo Mbeki, claimed that we didn't have the fiscal resources to provide antiretroviral medication for almost 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. And in fact, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard calculated that that policy choice, that policy decision, resulted in the avoidable loss of 365,000 South African lives and ensured that around 35,000 babies a year were born HIV positive because the country couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment.
This argument is not solely reserved for the Global South. In fiscal year 2017, the United States Congressional Budget Office reported spending $590 billion annually on their military, yet remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. A second argument is that in some cases, weapons breed conflict, further destabilizing fragile states.
The availability of weaponry often itself creates conflict. And even if there is a pre-running conflict, the availability of weapons or the prospect of the corruption involved in arms deals often intensifies that conflict and ensures that it lasts for far longer than it otherwise would.
As Andrew highlights, corruption and bribery is at the cornerstone of many arms deals. It frequently motivates the purchase of arms that are unnecessary or inappropriate.
Far too often, the equipment that is bought is inappropriate to address those needs, is often completely overspecified, and is really being bought because of the bribes involved. So to place that in context, the trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in global trade. So there is virtually almost never an arms deal that doesn't involve bribery and corruption. And that in turn undermines any fragile state. It undermines any state, in my opinion, but it makes it so much more difficult for a fragile state to build the institutions that are needed for it to become a more secure and stable state.
To the contrary, some would argue that the transfer of arms has helped some fragile states and have become symbolic of liberation and modernity. For example, in Mozambique and the colonial United States, the right to bear arms was interwoven into their liberation and critical to their fight for independence. However, in order to mitigate the negative impacts on a fragile state, the international community has implemented global regulations on the sale of arms.
Global regulation on the sale of arms is highly contentious and politically charged, as those with the power to change the system have the most to gain from loose regulation and shadowy dealings. On April 2, 2013, the United Nations General Assembly approved the Arms Trade Treaty. Commonly known as the ATT, it was the first international treaty to regulate the global transfer of weapons. The treaty sought the most stringent international standards for regulating trade in conventional arms and to eradicate illicit trade, for the purpose of, quote, reducing human suffering. Atrocities in Rwanda, the Balkans, and Central America in the 1980s and 1990s sparked calls on governments to better regulate arms. NGOs, lawyers, Nobel Prize laureates, and others made the connection between the transfer of arms and ongoing human rights violations. 154 states voted in favor of the ATT, while 3 states voted in opposition: Iran, North Korea, and Syria. The ATT formally went into effect on December 4, 2014. The treaty covers the sale of conventional arms, such as battle tanks, missiles, small arms, and light weapons. The ATT has set important precedent and has had a symbolic impact. For example, it created new legal standards bringing together international law and human rights commitments, as well as increased awareness on the arms trade industry and importance of regulation. And she argues it's also helped resource smaller states.
In allowing smaller states, especially transit states and importing states, to access resources, material resources, but also training and symbolic resources to be able to do some of the political work and the technocratic work that they need to do around protecting their societies from armed violence.
However, many argue that the treaty lacks meaningful enforcement, pointing to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported 16,706 civilian casualties between March 2015 and June of 2018. As of April 2018, 22 million Yemeni people are in need of humanitarian assistance, roughly 75% of the population.
The one major area in which the Arms Trade Treaty, to my mind, has been, I think I would go so far as to say it has been completely ineffective, has been in reining in the export activities of the major arms exporting states. The case of UK and other European, but primarily UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition for the war in Yemen has been the kind of flagship controversy. And whilst the ATT has added another layer of regulation that campaigners can use to point to say that the UK government is breaking its own rules, it hasn't added any extra force in being able to rein in that activity.
While others agree it has had an important symbolic impact, they have a harsher critique.
In practice, it hasn't made one bit of difference, and in certain respects has actually weakened global arms export controls. It has given the veneer that something has been done about this out-of-control global arms trade, when in fact absolutely nothing has changed.
Feinstein argues that the treaty is fundamentally flawed, as it is up to individual states to determine whether or not a deal is compliant, and there are no enforcement mechanisms.
They have virtually no impact when it comes to actually controlling who weapons are sold to and in what context and manner those weapons are sold. And again, the reason for that comes back to the lack of political will. And the Arms Trade Treaty has in no ways changed the calculus around political will.
Presently, Saudi Arabia coalition-led intervention in Yemen is a strong example of the impact of the global arms trade on fragile states and the failure of international regulation on arms trade.
The catastrophic war in Yemen, which has killed 56,000 people at least. They are imposing a blockade on the country. And between the war and the blockade, this has led to the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. It hasn't yet been declared a famine by the UN, but that's just probably from lack of data. Many people, children especially, are already starving to death. This is a famine that is being directly inflicted upon Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and its allies.
This intervention of Saudi-led coalition started in 2015 to prevent Houthi progress against the Yemeni government. The reason for this intervention seemed to be twofold. A, to support Yemeni's government, which has been an ally for Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, and B, more importantly, to defeat Houthis who are apparently being supported by Iran, which is an opponent of Saudi Arabia and most of the Arab countries. This military intervention has resulted into increased import of arms by Saudi Arabia, which in turn has resulted in arms proliferation. After India, Saudi Arabia is the second largest arms importer in the world. This import has gone up particularly since the military intervention in Yemen. As was clear in the motivation behind the arms trade, this import of arms comes from Saudi Arabia's international allies, the USA and the UK. The USA 8.4 billion and the UK 2.6 billion have been the largest arms supplied to Saudi Arabia since 2014. The USA is particularly keen to provide arms to Saudi Arabia for two reasons.
One, because the two countries, their politicians and their political parties, are making huge amounts of money out of the weapons that are being sold. One. Two, what the Saudis and their allies are doing in Yemen accords with British and American foreign policy. Because Yemen, in my opinion, is a precursor to regime change and possibly even an invasion of Iran.
Strong criticism have been also directed at the USA and the UK and other major European nations that continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. This points to failure on the part of international regulation. As a result of Saudi Arabia and other player intervention, now Yemen is no longer a fragile state, but it is a failed wish and cannot provide political goods to its people.
As highlighted by the case study of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the global sale of arms contributes to the instability or failure of fragile states. The ATT's ambiguous language and lack of enforcement mechanisms allow continued sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia, even in the face of human rights violations. The ATT is a great starting point, but tighter regulations and enforcement need to be implemented. Academics and activists have differing opinions on how we should move forward.
For me, meaningful regulation has to be anti-militarist, it has to be feminist, and it has to be post-colonial and anti-racist. And that's a really tall order, given the wider social inequalities and social structures in which contemporary arms regulation is embedded.
So if there's going to be serious regulation that actually cuts down and stops the arms sales to some of to countries in conflict and to some of these worst abusers, then it has to be conducted with rethinking security, rethinking the militaristic approach, and reducing the dependence in not just the West, also Russia, China, on military solutions to problems.
In an ideal world, there would be, let's say, an arms trade tax. Of course, this would never happen, but a tax for the seller and the buyer. Because right now, there essentially is no cost to exporting weapons. Regulations to enforce and hold countries accountable. Right now, the UN is just an international body that people sit and they speak, but they actually has no power to punish states.
Historically, global civil society has played a key role in demanding regulation. Arguably, that rings true now more than ever.
Sometimes in the face of what seems like the enormously powerful interests that are those involved in the global arms trade, that there is nothing we can do. But there was an extraordinary American anthropologist called Margaret Mead, who towards the end of her life said, history is changed by the actions of groups of thoughtful, committed citizens working together. It has always been the case, and it always will be. And on the arms trade, it is going to have to be the case, because no one else is going to do it.